All right, what's going on? Welcome back to the channel and another video. So a couple weeks ago, I did a video on this guy right here, my a6000, and clearly there's still a lot of you out there very interested in this camera. That video has gotten quite a few views, and I've had a few people message me since I put out that video, and they've asked, hey, how do you have your camera set up? What settings are you using? How do you have your custom function button set? Stills, video, the whole thing. So that's what I'm gonna be doing in today's video. I'm gonna walk you through exactly how I have my a6000 set up. So if you just picked up your camera, or maybe you're looking for some tips or some tricks or some new ways to maybe set it up for yourself, then this should be a good one for you. So let's go ahead and jump on into it. All right, so let's start off by going over kind of the physical buttons on the camera, the back side of it. We'll kind of start there, walk through some of that, and then we'll dive deeper into the menu systems and kind of walk you through how I've got all the individual settings set up. So on the back of the camera, let's start with like the control wheel buttons, so the D-pad buttons. So by default, the top button, the top D-pad button, the up D-pad button, that's set to cycle through your different display modes. I don't change that on any of my Sony cameras. I leave that as it is from the factory because that is something that I do use, and I do cycle through different like viewfinder displays, different LCD displays, depending on what I need. So if you press up, you can see we kind of just cycle through those different LCD or viewfinder options. For the most part, this is what I typically leave it on. It's a pretty empty frame. I just have the histogram down in the bottom right. That's what I like. I like a nice clean viewfinder LCD just with that histogram. That works out pretty well for me. The right D-pad button by default is ISO. Again, I don't change that. So if you press the right D-pad button, you go into changing your different ISO settings. I leave that default on all my Sony cameras. Again, ISO is something I need to get to pretty regularly, so that works out. It's pretty convenient. If you go onto the left D-pad button, same thing. This is pretty much the same across all my Sony cameras. It's the same default setting that you get when it comes out of the box. So if you hit the left D-pad, you go into your different drive modes. So right here, for some reason it's on like DRO bracketing, but by default it's usually in single shooting, but this is where you also get into your continuous shooting as well as some of your self timers and some like exposure brackets and other things like that. But for the most part, single shooting or continuous. On this camera, my a6000, for the most part, if I'm using it for stills, it's gonna be single shooting. So that's that. Now for the down button, this actually, you can't really see it right now, but the way I have the down D-pad button set up is to basically allow me to switch between autofocus and manual focus really quickly. On like the a6300 and the a6500, they've got a little switch right around the AEL button that allows you to switch between manual and autofocus. Since the a6000 doesn't have that, and switching between those two is something I do occasionally, it's somewhat common. I just remap the down D-pad button to switch between autofocus and manual focus. Now, the most important setting, in my opinion, as far as remapping buttons on the a6000 is what I use this center button for, and that is if you press the center button, this takes you into focus area modes. To me, this is one of the most fundamentally important things to change in the a6000 to make it very, very usable. Because the a6000 or really any of the APS-C cameras, they don't have a joystick. You need some way of being able to move around your focus point if you're in anything other than AF wide. And so by having the center button set up to go into the focus area mode, it makes that ability, it makes the process of actually changing your autofocus point much, much easier and much quicker. So you can see right here, we're in the focus area, so you can go from like wide to zone, center, although I've never used center on any of my cameras. To me, that one's kind of pointless. But then there's flexible spot, and then of course you get small, medium, and large flexible spot. And so when you're in this mode, of course, if you're like flexible spot or zone, you need to be able to move your focus point around the frame to wherever you need it to be in order to get the focus that you want. And so by having that center button set up, it makes that process of getting back in and being able to move your focus point around really, really quickly. And so let's say you're in, like we are right now, flexible spot large, and you want to be able to move your focus point to something different. Like right now I've got it over the Minolta logo. Let's say I wanted to focus on the very front part of the lens. All I would have to do is really quickly just double tap that button, and then I can start moving my focus point around, and then I can start shooting again. So to me, that's one of the most important settings to change in the a6000 to make this thing much more usable. Remap that center button to go into the focus area mode. Okay, so let's move on to the custom function buttons. There's really only two dedicated like C1 buttons or C buttons. There's one up on top by the shutter button, which is C1. So if you press that, that takes me into white balance. You know, I used to change white balance on the fly a little bit more often. I still change it often enough to make it its own dedicated custom function button, but for the most part, for most situations, I leave it in auto white balance. Every now and again, I'll change it into one of these different modes, or even go into manual Kelvin. Sometimes when I'm out shooting, even though I know that in post I'm going to change the white balance anyway, sometimes when I'm out shooting, I like my image or my viewfinder scene to be a little bit warmer than what it actually is. So sometimes I'll manually go in and change it, but for the most part, auto white balance is where I'm going to be at. Okay, so C2, which is down here in the very bottom right, and this is also when you're in review mode, this is also your delete button, but if you're just in shoot mode, then C2 is just another custom function button. And if I hit that, that takes me into lock-on AF. Lock-on autofocus, I think, is something that's really underutilized on Sony cameras across the line, whether it's an a6000 or an a7 III, an a7R4. I feel like a lot of people don't really take advantage of lock-on AF. It is a really useful feature, and so when I do want to use it, I can get to it pretty quickly with C2. Now, the last thing on the back of the camera in terms of custom function buttons being remapped is the AEL button, or the, by default out of the box, it stands for automatic exposure lock. I changed that to be eye autofocus. Right now I'm in continuous AF, so obviously it's not going to work. On the a6000, IAF only works if you're in AF single, so it doesn't really work in this particular case, but if I am using this camera for portraits, I can pop it over into AF single, and then I can use IAF, and that works pretty well. So that's how that's set up. Okay, so that covers pretty much all of the external buttons. Let's go into the function menu now. So we'll hit the FN button. So right here I have pretty much all of this remapped, and the way I set up the function menu is not to be redundant. I don't really want anything in the function menu to be the same as any of the external buttons. And ideally what I want is all the external buttons, I want those to be the things that I'm going to use the most. And then I want everything in the function menu to be the kind of the secondary things that I don't change as often, but I still want to get to a little bit more often than some of the other random things you'll find in the menu system. So in here, for example, in this first spot in the upper column, you've got focus mode. So if I did want to go from like AF continuous to manual or AF single or any of these others, I could, but 99% of the time I'm in AF continuous. Let's go back. Again, metering mode, I don't change this very often, but if I do want to be really precise with my metering, I can. Dynamic range, auto HDR. Most of the time I shoot in RAW on this camera, so this doesn't really apply too much. I know some people would turn it off because it does affect the way that the preview on the LCD and the viewfinder display your image. Personally, I mostly use my histogram for an idea of what kind of exposure I'm getting, so I don't really worry about it. I just leave it on. I prefer that slightly more contrasty look anyway, so but if I do want to change it, it's in there. Quality, right now I've got it set to fine. Most of the time I'm on RAW. On the a6000, I will occasionally use this camera to do things like thumbnail images for YouTube, and those I pretty much shoot in those I'll usually shoot in JPEG mode. But if I'm out doing street photography or something, then I've got it in RAW. Again, aspect ratio, 3:2, 16:9. These are your two options on the a6000. Again, I have this here because, again, like I just mentioned, I do use this camera for, using it for thumbnails for YouTube, and those need to be 16:9. And so I can do that and get an idea what the framing is going to look like. But again, most of the time it's in 3:2. Image size, since I'm in RAW, that doesn't really apply. If I'm shooting in JPEG, then you get obviously your small, medium, and large option. Let's go back to the beginning. Creative style. So I've got a couple creative styles in here that I kind of switch between. Standard is what I'm in most of the time. Every now and again when I'm out doing shooting, like particularly street photography, I'll sometimes go into this black and white mode just because it's kind of cool and interesting and just a different way of shooting sometimes, by just going into black and white and focusing more on light and contrast rather than taking color into account. So that can be a fun way to shoot during street sessions. And then I do have one other creative style in here, which is this neutral one that I've kind of modified a little bit. So this one is what I'll use when I want a slightly less, so somehow actually these settings have gotten changed. Anyways, so this is a profile that I use if I'm going to be doing any sort of like filming on this camera, and it's video clips that I know I'm going to want to color grade later. So since this camera doesn't really have dedicated profiles like S-Log or HLG, this is kind of the best you can really get, is just by going in here and modifying these. Now normally this should be set to -3, -2, and then this should be -1. I'm not sure why these got moved, but that's normally the neutral profile that I use and that I like. So So yeah, so there's that. Picture effect, again, this isn't something that I really ever use. I'm not even sure why I have that in the menu system, but probably just because I needed to fill a spot. Zebras, this is something I do use. I will turn that on every now and again. Peaking off and on. If I'm in manual focus, I'll definitely use peaking. And then peaking color, I'll change that every now and again. Usually it's on white, but sometimes that doesn't really show up too well, so I can change it to like a red or whatever else I want to use, like a yellow and red in here as well. And then finally in the function menu, I've got the grid line. Most of the time I've got it set up for diagonal and square grid. I used to only ever have rule of thirds, but I've really been liking having that diagonal in there and having that, like, you know, being able to see exactly where the center of the frame is. That's kind of helpful sometimes. So that's something I've been playing around with. But anyways, that's the function menu. Okay, so let's go into the actual menu system now. Let me get back to the beginning here and kind of walk through each one of these menus. Some of this we've already kind of covered. Okay, so the first main tab, the photo video tab, page 1. Image size, again, right now I'm in RAW, so it doesn't really matter. We already talked about that. File format for video, I definitely recommend using XAVCS. You don't really want to be using these other two. This is going to be the best file codec for you, so definitely change that. Okay, so on page 2 for record setting, I'm either going to be in 24 or 60. I don't really use 30. 24 for anything that is going to be for sure not needing to be slowed down. So like talking head stuff, like a YouTube video, that would be 24. If there's anything that I'm filming that I know I'm going to want to slow down, I'll use 60. But most of the time I just leave it on 24, but I can switch between those. Again, single shooting, fill flash. This doesn't really apply for most people. I don't really use flash on this camera very often, but fill flash is what you're going to be wanting to use. If you ever do use this camera like for a wedding, for dance floor or whatever, you might want to use rear sync to get those really slow shutter speed kind of ziggy lines in the background, but that's whole nother video. Flash comp, that's not something I really use. Red eye reduction off. Focus mode continuous, again, we already talked about that. So page 3. Focus area, again, I change between zone is what I probably use the most, and then flexible spot, large, medium, small. So flexible spot or zone is what I use for the most part on this camera. AF illuminator, that I turn off. That's a little LED on the front, and low light, it'll shine a little bright light to kind of help the camera focus. I personally turn it off. I don't really find that it really helps that much. So AF drive speed, AF track duration, these don't really apply to still shooting. They really apply more to video. To kind of give you an idea what they are, what they do. So AF drive speed, the top one, essentially what that is once the camera begins to focus on a new subject, that determines how quickly it'll focus on it. Will it either, so if you go in here and you go to say fast, then once it goes to focus on something new, that will basically snap it into focus immediately. Whereas if you go to slow, the transition from focus from the first object to the second object, it'll be a smoother, kind of more deliberate rack focus. So that's what drive speed is. For the most part, I leave it on normal. AF track duration, let's see, how do I explain this? So when you're tracking a subject, so this basically determines how sensitive the camera is to things moving in front of whatever the camera is currently focused on. So let's say, for example, if you're outside, you're filming yourself, and let's say, somebody walks between you and the camera. If you've got this set to high, and then as soon as something walks between you and the camera, it's going to immediately try to focus on that new thing. And then as that object moves out of frame, then it'll pop back focus to you. If you've got it set to normal, then there's a little bit of a delay. So if somebody were to walk between you and the frame, or you and your camera, the camera isn't going to immediately try to focus on that new thing. It's going to wait a couple seconds before it's going to really react to changes. So for the most part, like for example, if you are going to be outside and you are going to be filming yourself and you want the focus to be as sluggish as possible and you want it to react to changes as slowly as possible, then you're going to want AF track duration to be on normal, drive speed to be on slow. If you really want a fast, like really snappy focus, then you're going to want to set this to fast. But anyways, that's what those are. Hopefully that makes sense. Exposure comp, exposure step. I don't really use these because I for the most part, I shoot in manual mode, not because I think you have to be some fancy shooter or a pro. That's just how I choose to shoot. I just personally don't shoot in aperture or shutter priority very often. If I do shoot in one of those modes, it's usually going to be aperture priority. So exposure comp, because I'm not actually actively in one of those shooting modes, it's grayed out. Exposure step by default 0.3 or a third of a stop. That's just kind of default. I just leave it that way. Page 4, ISO, obviously that's going to change depending on scene. Mirroring mode for the most part is going to be multi, white balance, we talked about that. DRO we talked about, creative style, neutral, yeah, so we already kind of talked about some of these. All right, so moving on to page 5. Most of these I leave alone. Long exposure noise reduction. This is definitely one that I turn off. So long exposure noise reduction, what that's going to do is after you take an image, like a long exposure image, what it'll do is it'll do like an algorithm, it'll do a calculation. It'll try to remove noise in camera on that image. But when you're out shooting and you have this turned on, what'll end up happening, let's say you take a 30-second long exposure, it'll take like another 20 to 30 seconds after that for the camera to do its like analysis, to do its noise reduction process. So it slows down the process of taking repeated frames. And on top of that, I'd rather just do the noise reduction myself in post. So that's something I turn off. It speeds up the overall operation of the camera, as well as just allows you to get more flexibility in post. High ISO noise reduction, yeah, I don't really play with that. Lock on AF, again, we mentioned that. Smile face detect. So again, this is basically just your different detection options. I have it set the face detection on. If you are going to use it for portraits, then obviously you're going to want that. Page 6, soft skin effect, that definitely stays off. And a lot of this is grayed out, I think, because I'm in RAW, so it's not going to really apply. But auto object framing, this I don't play with. That by default is off. Essentially what that does is it will kind of do this weird algorithm where, again, like if you take a photo in certain circumstances, it'll try to create a copy of that photo and then create a more interesting composition, so the literature says, but that's kind of silly to me. I don't even think that's included in newer Sony cameras anymore. Scene selection, that's if you're in scene selection mode. I don't really play with any of that. And all of the rest of this is pretty much default. Steady shot is currently off because the lens I have doesn't have OSS, but if I did, it would be on. Color space default is sRGB. I leave that alone. That's kind of the standard. Again, auto slow shutter, that's off. I'm trying to remember, what is auto slow shutter? Oh, that's another video only mode. Again, this is one where it tries to analyze the scene, and if it identifies that it can lower the shutter speed lower than what you currently have it set to in really dark situations, it'll do it automatically. I turn it off because I'm going to be in manual anyway. Audio recording is obviously on, so even if you're planning on using an external recorder either into another camera or like a Zoom H1 or a Zoom H6 or whatever external recorder you have, definitely recommend leaving audio recording on because it's going to give you a good scratch track to align your audio to your video. So definitely leave that on even if you don't plan on using the internal audio. Wind noise reduction I turn off. I don't want it doing any sort of weird algorithm to my audio. Shooting tip list, that is basically, to be honest, I don't even know what that is. That's like an A6000 thing. Memory recall and memory. So if you go into the memory recall function dial or on the function dial, so memory recall is where you actually pull up the settings that you have saved. This memory function down here is where you actually go in and assign things to memory recall. I'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so moving on to the next tab. Zebras, again, when they are on, right now again I'm set to 95. That's really just a personal preference thing. Manual focus assist, that's on. So that is when you are, so if you are in manual focus and you go to zoom in on something, it'll actually zoom in on the subject so you can get a more precise focus. So that can be kind of useful. And then it's got a 2-second timer that backs out of it once you're done focusing. So that's that, and that's what that 2 seconds is right here. Just after you've stopped focusing, it waits 2 seconds, and then it bounces out of that zoom in mode. Grid lines we talked about. Auto review. This is again when you go to replay an image, or not when you go to replay an image, but after you take an image, that's how long it'll display the image on the back of the LCD or the viewfinder, so you can kind of review it. I do like having that turned on. I know you haven't, what you see is what you get exposure through the viewfinder and the LCD, but when you're doing street photography and other things like that, you're trying to see if you caught the right moment, so it's nice to see. So I'll just leave that on. And then display button. So this is where you can go into your actual viewfinder and your LCD and change. When you cycle through the display button right here, it'll actually, you can remove or add in different options. So if you know, for example, you never want to see display all info, you can turn that off, and then when you cycle through your different display options, it just won't even show it to you. It'll skip right past it. So that's something I personally leave that on. These are the settings I have for that though. And then this is what I have set up for the monitor. All right, so page 2, peaking level high, peaking color white, we talked about that. The rest of this is pretty much all default. Page 3, pre-AF is turned off. I can't remember if that's on by default or not. I think it might be. pre-AF, what that does is when your camera's like pointed at something, the camera will basically autofocus on it, almost like it's in continuous autofocus, even without you pressing the AF on or the shutter button. Personally, I don't like it because it just wears out the battery, and it's not like it really takes that long for the camera to focus. So that I definitely turn off. Zoom setting, obviously optical zoom only if you have like the 16 to the 55 kit lens. You know, I really only want optical zoom. I don't want to do a digital zoom beyond that. This is some other weird stuff I don't really use, so this is all just default. That's default. Right here, AF with shutter. If you do want to use back button focus, this is where you would de-link the half press AF with shutter. So you just go in here and set that off if you want to use back button focus. Personally, I don't use back button focus. To me, on mirrorless cameras, for most people, it's not really needed these days. So I just use the standard AF with shutter. This is all pretty much default. I know some people like to turn off the electronic front curtain shutter. I recommend not doing that. I say leave the front curtain shutter on. Some people turn it off because they feel like they're worried about banding or, you know, other weird issues like that. That is a very, very rare issue that doesn't happen very often. When it does happen, that 1% of the time where it does happen, you can go in here and turn that off, but I leave it on. That's the default setting. I feel like it's better for the shutter itself. And you know, I just never had any issues with it, so I just leave it on. Yeah, the rest of this doesn't really apply. That's all default. That's all default. Okay, so settings page 6, this is where you actually go in and change all of your actual menus, like I just showed at the very beginning of the video. So if you go into this setting right here, this is where I showed you my function menu, my upper, and then my lower settings. This is where you actually go in and change all those. So I'll pause right here for a second, and if you want to, you can pause the video and you can copy these over to yourself. So that's page 1, and then this is page 2. Okay, so that's the function menu. Again, custom key settings, if you go into here, same thing. This is where you actually go in and you can remap all your buttons. I'll pause here really quickly if you want to pause the video and copy these over to your camera. And then page 2. Cool. All right, so dial wheel setup. This is something that I changed by default. The scroll wheel on the back of the camera right here is shutter speed, and the scroll wheel on the very top right here, this guy is normally going to be your aperture. Since I came from Canon, and Canon by default has the scroll wheel on the back as aperture, I just make this the aperture. I go into this setting and I flip those. So by default, it's going to be on this top one, shutter speed for this dial back here, and aperture for this dial up at the very top. Again, I go in and change it so that way my back dial is aperture and my top wheel is going to be shutter speed. That's just my preference, again, because I came from Canon, and that's more similar to what a Canon setup has by default. That's what my brain is accustomed to. So yeah, that's what I do. If you go down here, dial wheel exposure comp. So that is if you are in a mode like shutter or aperture priority, that allows you to assign either this back scroll wheel or this top scroll wheel to be your exposure compensation adjustments, because this camera, unlike an A7 III, for example, does not have a dedicated exposure compensation wheel. So I set this top wheel to be the exposure comp because, again, that's more in line with like the A7 III or where it would be. But again, I don't really shoot in aperture priority very often, but if I do, then that's how I set my exposure comp. So yeah, anyways, moving on. This is default dial wheel lock. That's just if you want to actually lock the settings so that moving the wheel doesn't change anything. It doesn't really work very well on Sony cameras. I wish they would change that. Okay, so connectivity stuff, not something I really use. Nothing really to talk about there. Same thing in the application list. Playback, not really a lot in here. I think the only thing is display rotation. I think that's the only thing I change. It has it set to manual. I have it set to off. So that just means when I go to playback an image, a vertical image will take up the full length of the screen rather than being kind of a small sliver of an image right in the center of the frame. I can actually, let me just show you really quickly. So if we were to take an image, well, this won't really work actually because it's in horizontal mode, but anyways, I think you guys get the idea. So for example, like this is a vertical image. So by turning it to off, that vertical image takes up the largest real estate on the screen as it possibly can, rather than just being vertical in the frame. I want to see as much of that image as I possibly can. I'd rather just turn the camera sideways by 90 degrees and see more detail that way, rather than see this really small thumbnail. So hopefully that makes sense. Page 2, nothing really in there. And then onto our little toolbox tab. Not really much to say here. I do have audio signals turned off. By default, they're turned on. I just like to turn them off. I don't really like the sound of that beep. Page 2, I don't think there's really anything here to talk about. That's all default. Page 3 is pretty much all default. Page 4, pretty much all default with the exception of obviously date and time. That's set up to be, you know, wherever I'm at in the world. And then let's see, page 5, file number, new folder, folder name. None of this has really changed. That's pretty much all default as well. And then again, page 6, this is the very last one. Nothing really to change there either. So that's really pretty much about it. All right guys, so as I'm editing this video, I actually realized there's a couple things I forgot to mention and I kind of glossed over. So I just want to double back really quick and go over those. So let's head back over to the a6000. So the very first thing I forgot to mention is if you go into the ISO menu and you go up to auto ISO, you do get an ability to kind of set a minimum and a maximum ISO. So if for whatever reason you are using auto ISO, for me, it's not something that I use really very much. But I will occasionally use it if I'm using like aperture priority or shutter priority. It kind of makes sense to use auto ISO in those situations. But nonetheless, you can kind of go in here and you can cap the minimum and the maximum ISO. So for this particular setting, I've got the ISO minimum set to 100, which kind of makes sense. I don't know why you would really want that to be anything higher than 100. But as far as the maximum goes, I have my ISO maximum set to 6400. I'm pretty tolerant of grain. I don't mind a little bit of grain or noise in my images, especially for street photography. What I would recommend on the a6000 is probably leaving it at either 64 or 3200 for this particular camera. But again, it's really gonna kind of come down to like your needs and the way you shoot and your tolerance for a little bit of grain. But yeah, that's one more setting that I forgot to mention. All right, and then the other thing that I forgot to mention in the earlier part of the video is with regards to memory recall. We sort of kind of covered it. I said I was gonna cover it more in depth later and I forgot to, so let's go back to that. So if we go to the top dial on the camera, the mode dial, if we change it to the MR setting for memory recall, that takes us into our memory recall screen here. And we've got 3 settings, 1, 2, and 3. So I use these mostly for saving video settings. You can save them for still settings as well, for stills mode settings. But I've got them all assigned to video mode settings. So the first one is going to be, again, it's video, 24 frames per second. So that means my shutter speed's gonna be 1/50. I've got my aperture set generically to f4 and ISO 400 and a few other changes in here you can see as well. If you want to see all the settings, you can kind of pause the video. You can see how I've got it set up. But basically, the main gist of this first one is that it's 24p footage with a very standard color profile. So this is really good if I just need like a quick talking head. I don't really care about color grading it later. This is what I use. Number 2, the second memory recall function, basically the same thing as number 1, still 24p footage. The only difference is this has a slightly flatter color profile. So this is going to be something if I feel like maybe I want to color grade it later on, I'll flip over to this as kind of like a quick way to get set up for that. And then number 3 in memory recall, this third setting. So this is actually going to be for slow-mo footage. So this is set to 60 frames per second. And then of course, along with that, my shutter speed is bumped up to 1/125th of the second. Still f4, ISO 400. And again, you can see the rest of my settings. You can pause the screen, you can copy this down and see what it looks like. But yeah, essentially this is just a really easy way for me to kind of get into those video settings. And then from there, I can change my aperture and my ISO and anything else I want for whatever it is that I'm filming. But this is just a really quick and easy way for me to get to those video settings that I use the most. Okay, so now that's really truly it. Those are the 2 things I kind of forgot to mention earlier on in the video. And so yeah, now back to the outro. All right, guys, that is it. That is how I have my a6000 set up. Hopefully you found this useful. If you just picked up this camera and you're looking to get yours set up as well, hopefully this gives you a jumping off point. By no means is this the perfect way of setting it up. It's just the way I have it set up. So use it as a guideline for yourself and getting your a6000 ready to go. But anyways, if you found this video useful, by all means, hit that thumbs up button. It would mean a lot to me. It always helps out the channel. Also, again, way more content coming out this year. So many things planned, so many video ideas I have in the works. So if you want to see that, definitely hit the subscribe button. And then as always, questions, comments, anything that I missed on my a6000 setup that you want to know, leave those questions in the comment section down below. And then other than that, guys, as always, take care, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.